All right, hello. So today, or this week, I guess I should say, we're going to be looking at the industrial period in the United States. So I sort of break this up into two parts. Industrialization, to me, there are two really important things that are happening. The first is like social change and progress and technological innovation. And that's what we're gonna look at today, or in this video. And then there's also like the industrial part and the working part, and that's sort of what a lot of people focus on with this time period the most. So we'll talk about that separately. But one of the things that I try to get students to think about when we're looking at this time period, right? Like if you could time travel back to the United States in the industrialization time period. So basically we're talking post-Civil War, right? Anytime from like 1865 on, like if you time travel back to New York here in the 1880s, you could probably get around, right? You can navigate, you see things that are obviously different, but that are somewhat like what we see today. You know, advertising, transportation, you know, the size and scope of buildings. If you time traveled back to like 1840s New York, it would still probably be pretty foreign to us. Like we'd have a hard time navigating. So this time period is really essential for a lot of ways, but one of the things that's most essential about it is that in many ways, this is like the creation of modern society. Now, obviously there's some differences, but the basic way that we live today, the way that we work, the way that we go to school, the way that we communicate and travel, the origins for most of those things can trace themselves back to this time period. So here's a picture of our very own Johnson City around the same time, around the 1880s. Got an opera house here in the background, horse and wagon, you know, more sort of small scale portable transportation. The railroad has sort of made some of this stuff possible. So this is the time period that we were talking about. So when I'm talking about technology, right, and technological innovations, we're looking at everything, okay? Communications, travel, the way that we just fundamentally live on a day-to-day basis. So there's some important changes that happen here, but one of the most important is taking electricity and converting it to a source of light, which is accomplished in the 1870s. And there's a lot of back and forth on, you know, who's creating some of this stuff and who's doing what. What's really interesting about this time period is there's a lot of overlap, right? There's a lot of the same people, a lot of different people working on the same things. So for our purposes, it's not, you know, as important to recognize that Charles Brush created the arc for streetlights or that Edison gets a lot of the credit for inventing the light bulb. It's taken into account that all of the work done by those people and people like Tesla, who's also doing work with electricity, that the impact of their inventions and innovations are realized. So for example, converting energy or electricity into a light energy source changes the way that people can fundamentally live, right? So for example, if you now have streetlights, which again, cities had streetlights and things, oil lamps and lanterns well before this time period, but now you've got more light available. It's easier to get light, which means you can have light further. You can light not just your city, but you can take it further out. It also means that if it's easier to light these things, it's also going to be easier to light buildings. So if you can light up buildings, that means that you can do things more frequently, more events, right? Think about your like daily life, right? If you have a job where you work till like 9 or 10, 11 at night, or you get done with school and you go out for a drink or for dinner with friends, you're doing a lot of your activities after the sun sets, right? you're doing a lot of activities that need a light source. So you had some of that stuff before, but you don't have it in a modern way until this time period. But once you do that, it changes everything, right? Cities change the way that they are built and shaped based on this innovation. People change the way that they live and work based on this innovation, right? And that's huge. That's what I mean when I'm talking about like impact on society, right? But it's not just technology, or I'm sorry, it's not just like electric lighting. It's everything. Okay. And again, like you had railroads before the Civil War. After the Civil War, you continue to have more and more railroads built, which makes it easier to travel, right? The Transcontinental Railroad, which comes up sort of the topic of the West last week. Those things make it easier to travel, right? Electric lighting makes it easier to accommodate social changes at nighttime, right? Telegraphs and then eventually the telephone make it easier to communicate. So you see that innovation in the realm of travel, right? Automobiles come up. And again, you can look at automobiles as sort of like an extension or an evolution of horse and buggy travel, but that's what you get in this time period. Airplanes by the early 1900s, 1903, are being innovated. And within 20 years, you go from, traveling 120 feet at the first flight in North Carolina to most countries having some form of like an air force during World War I, right? So the thing that I want you to remember and keep coming back to on this time period is it's not just like one change or two or three changes here and there. Everything is changing, and it's changing very rapidly, right? We're looking at basically like a 40, 50-year window from 1865 to 1915, right? So think for a second at how much technology has changed our lives, right? Just within the last 20 years, the technology of going from like those still sort of like clunky flip phones or mobile phones to the way that phones are now, right? A lot less people have landlines. People have smartphones that you can communicate, you can email, you can do your classes, you can do your job all on one device, right? That's just within 20 years. And that's one thing. Imagine everything in your life changing that rapidly in a 20 or 30-year window. That's what's going on here with industrialization. Everything is just accelerating, progress. So sort of next week, we're going to look at like the slowing down or like taking a step back from that progress. But industrialization in many ways is really just progress on top of progress. It's everything. And that's what everyone's sort of pushing for. Okay. So this stuff is going to start having an impact on society, right? And a good example of this is taking something that comes up with like what we normally think of with industrialization, and that's the assembly line, right? Where Ford really revolutionizes the assembly line in his factory, and the goal is efficient work, right? It's making things more quickly, which makes things more affordable for people. But that is also going to have a social impact, right? Because that particular innovation is going to make it easier to mass produce things, right? So if you're mass producing things, and again, think about an automobile, if you're driving your car and your axle breaks, right? All you have to do is replace that one part. You don't have to buy a new car. That part is interchangeable. You can replace parts in here and there, and it's cheaper than replacing a whole new thing, every time something breaks. It also means that you're not having like an individually handmade item, right? Take today, right? If you want to buy a shirt, and you go to Walmart or the mall or like Penny or something, like if you go online to some of these companies and you buy a shirt, it is normally cheaper than if you go to like Etsy and someone is hand making you a shirt. You're paying extra for an individual, unique made item that's also being produced by hand. So in this time period, you have all these changes, which means like the workforce is changing, the way people living is changing. People now have more jobs available, they have more spendable income, and that's going to coincide with having more items to spend that money on. Right? So in this time period, you get like sort of the emergence of like a middle class. You get the emergence of people just having stuff, just lots of stuff being made and bought, which is totally different than the way things had been done like even 50 years before the Civil War. So that's what we're looking at. We're talking about like how this stuff is having a social impact on society during the industrialization period. And here's a picture of the airplane from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Now, the other thing that you start seeing, and we looked at this a little bit with the West, there are people moving to the West post-Civil War, right? Farmers, newly arrived immigrants, freed former slaves. There's a whole lot of movement in the post-war America, but that also includes going into cities, right? So all this technology that we're talking about helps create what we would think of as like a modern city. And the people moving into these cities in the late 1800s are the same sorts of groups moving out west. And the easiest way to characterize it is people who are looking for opportunity. Now, one of the things to look at when we're talking about social changes going on in cities and responses to those changes, you start to get the rise in like, immigrant groups coming in. So in the East, we're looking at primarily groups from Europe. In the West, you got immigrants coming in places like Asia. Coinciding with all these new opportunities, there is going to be some pushback, right? In the United States, there is a period of sort of ebbing and flowing of the stance that Americans take towards immigrants. In the late 1800s, there's a push to try to like assimilate newly arrived people into the United States, but there's also a push to exclude people from coming into the United States. Now, I'm not sure if you've been following recent news within the last few years. There's a lot of sort of pushback towards immigrants coming into the country, coming from a lot of different places. In the 1880s, there was a push for exclusion of people coming from China. And in 1882, there's a Chinese Exclusion Act passed that forbid people or excluded people from coming into the United States from China. Right, so that's based solely on social structures in place as that were a result of technological and modern changes to the city landscape. Now, Asian exclusion was aimed primarily at the West Coast, right? People coming into California, and it is based on people living in California or people living on the West Coast who resented people coming in from Asia, and they characterized Chinese immigrants as in a negative light, right? Based solely on the fact that they were coming in from China. So a lot of the rhetoric that you see today against immigrant groups coming into the country had been around for a while. And in the 1880s, it resulted in exclusion of China, people from China coming into the country. And that's going to have a long-term impact on population demographics in the United States, because it's going to be several decades, and it's eventually going to go to other places like Japan. It'll be several decades before that exclusion is removed. So in this video, we're looking at how technological changes shaped modern society, shaped and gave birth and rise to modern cities and that sort of thing, and created opportunities. So in our next video, we're going to look at the opportunities that were available to people in the urban areas of the country, and then we're going to see what worker issues come up along with that.